So, an evident trend of nowadays is a passion for a civilization which replaces nation in certain political environment. At least this is what one can observe in Russia with its trend to a civilization nationalism, as it is called by certain experts, or what I would call civilizationism. Actually, whereas a number of ethnic groups wanted to be viewed as the nations in the late Soviet decades, they made all the best to present themselves as distinct civilizations in the 1990s and the very early 2000s. However, whereas nation is defined with a reference to political arrangement, institutions, and state borders, a notion of civilization is more obscure. It is frequently defined with a reference to a dominant religion, but it can be also defined with respect to to particular outlook, system of values, sacred writing system, and even economic system. It is its borders are fluid and fluctuating. As a result, a view of civilization suffers of subjectivity. That is why it seems tempting for expanding imperial powers. A civilization paradigm has arrived in the late 19th century to be refuted by a number of Western scholars 100 years later. By contrast, with the fall of the communism, it gained a second life in Russia, from whence it expanded to the post-Soviet countries. It owes its popularity in Russia to the fact that it got married to the national idea and anti-Western sentiment there. There were striking differences between liberal Western and ethnic Soviet approaches to nation. Western political science has long viewed a nation mostly as a political community of people with full-fledged rights. By contrast, under an authoritarian regime where the political rights of the citizens were severely restricted, the ideologues who understood the high symbolic meaning of the nation had a temptation to define it in historical and cultural or ethnic rather than political terms. This made up a basis of the Soviet outlook and was inherited by most of the post-Soviet states. A logic of the Soviet political system approved by the Soviet theory of ethnos inevitably led to the racialization of ethnos as an integrated collective body. This logic proceeded from its perception as an organism and included such precepts as the originality of national culture, the national character, the unity of psychic disposition, according to Stalin, a search for their persistence in ethnogenesis, and finally, a claim of endogamy, which made ethnos a biological population. That is why in this part of the world, nationalism manifested itself as an ethnic one, which was a projection of essentialization of culture as a closed body. The term of civilization evidently followed a similar trajectory, whereas in the late 18th century it was an integral element of an evolutionary outline represented by the three-age system of savagery, barbarism, and civilization. Then, 100 years later, the first cases of the civilization paradigm appeared. Hence, a humanity was viewed as a set of various civilizations alien to each other, developing side by side and never crossing with each other. More than another half a century would have to pass before Arnold Toynbee would pay more attention to contacts between civilizations. However, to him as well, civilizations appeared as integrated wholenesses which could make contacts, conduct a dialogue, bring forth one another, but were not able to merge or exchange human resources. If they tried to do this, Toynbee believed, they embarked on a great risk. Actually, a rich civilization discourse of the last 30 years in Russia demonstrates a great diversity. Nowadays, there are four general views and four ways to interpret civilization in Russia. Firstly, there is a scholarly search of a new paradigm which would overcome a reductionism of the Marxist formation approach. Secondly, a political project which opposes the unipolar world and instead wants the world to be a multipolar system consisting of a number of distinct civilizations with their own original cultures and, importantly, their own political systems. Thirdly, a geopolitical project focused on an inevitable conflict of two civilizations, a terrestrial one, Russia, and a maritime one, Western and German, general, or Anglo-Saxon one in particular. And finally, an eschatological view of reality as a confrontation between cosmic good and cosmic evil, which is perceived by the Russian Orthodox Church as a confrontation of Russia as a katechon, that is a restrainer, with the collective West. Over the last decades, the Russian Orthodox radicals divide the world into two civilizations, one of Jesus Christ and another one of Antichrist. Let's start with the first group of authors. While discussing the civilization approach, certain post-Soviet scholars viewed society as a living, developing, and viable organism. Under such a discourse, civilization was described with the shared social cultural forms of activity, cultural values, the symbolic code, mentality, and even sometimes with self-awareness. To put it differently, no matter what reserves are made, a civilizational community forced out a class community, and a class ideology was replaced by a nationalist one with its typical organic worldview. Another group encompassed politicians who manifested various attitudes towards their civilization ideology depending on both their political orientation and the period of time. In the 1990s, most of the liberals and Democrats took Eurasianism with a suspicion and usually rejected it as an inadmissible conservative doctrine. However, it seemed attractive for a historian, Sergei Stankevich, the President Yeltsin's aide. As a higher bureaucrat, he became a statist and an admirer of a strong power. He believed that Russia needed a great idea with an emphasis on the great mission, and he worried about ethnic Russians who suffered of discrimination in the newly established ethnocratic states. But in general, Eurasianism was picked up by the alternative elites, and marginal theoreticians who were called red-brown in the 1990s. In the Russian discourse, Eurasianism turned into a nationalist ideology aimed at the national consolidation with a reference to a shared culture. One of its advocates presented Eurasia as a civilizational body of the people and state. He hoped this idea could reconcile reds and whites. A famous philosopher, Alexander Panarin, called for shaping of the Eurasian civilization, which he identified with the Third Rome and ascribed it with a world mission to secure a plurality of civilizations. Notably, he acknowledged that Eurasian was a pseudonym of the most serious and timely topics of our national consciousness, which aimed at the Russian integrity. Later on, General Leonid Ivashov added that a civilization paradigm reflected a new reality where national states were losing their former power and were being replaced with international organizations which he viewed as the world ethnocultural civilizations, namely Russia, China, India, European Union, and the United States. To put it other way, he identified them with the large states, and it was just such a state or civilization that was a geopolitical actor. They were integrationists and empire builders among the admirers of the civilizational idea. The former believed that Eurasianism was able to harmonize interests of all the peoples and religions at the Russian territory. They viewed history as a cyclic process, represented cultural pluralism, valued empire, and wanted it to survive. They also manifested a thirst for a state ideology, which had to be a conservative one. A Eurasian idea was preferable as it was able to shape a single Eurasian people devoid of any ethnocentrism. By contrast, the empire builders were dreaming of a USSR re-emergence and shifted to geopolitics. Now, as the Russian Orthodox Church was anxious about its unity of the canonical territory, it was also interested in Russia as a single Eurasian civilization. Moreover, the priest based this unity on some spirit rather than on any strictly defined territory. Thus, this community encompassed all the compatriots or the Russian Orthodox people, regardless of the state borders. At the same time, in the 1990s, other writers, journalists, and politicians, depending on their ethnic or confessional affiliation, constructed at the same territory such civilizations as Caucasian, North Caucasian, Turkic Tatar, Muslim, Arctic, nomadic, and the like. Moreover, an emphasis on culture enables some authors to identify it with an ethnic culture, and this approach opens the door to an ethnicization of civilization. Thus, such civilizations appeared in literature as Adige, Dagestani, Bulgarian, Chuvash, Armenian, Moldovan, Mongol, Kalmyk, Kazakh, and the civilization of the Sakha people. In other words, where the Soviet scholars used the concept of cultural community or the economic cultural type, in the 1990s, civilizations were constructed which replaced the former nations. However, all these constructions were marginalized or neglected in Russia later on. In the very early 21st century, the Russian authorities actively discussed the new imperial idea, and they got interested in presenting Russia as the Eurasian or just Russian civilization. The idea was shared by bureaucrats, security officials, military, and patriotic businessmen. The Russian Doctrine, published in 2005, was their manifest. In 2012, President Putin picked up an idea of the Eurasian Union together with Eurasian civilization. All this hang together with the growing confrontation with the West, a struggle for so-called sovereign democracy, opposition to colored revolutions, and a territorial expansion, annexation of the Crimea. This view made up a basis of the President Putin's idea of the Eurasian Union and was implemented in particular in his support of the breakaway territories of the new post-Soviet states. On his part, Patriarch Kirill was developing an idea of the Russian Orthodox civilization to legitimate and to secure a canonical territory of the Russian Orthodox Church. Okay, now the third group included those ones who were engaged in geopolitics. A plurality of civilizations seemed a lip service for them, and while following the Soviet ideology, they viewed the world in terms of a confrontation, but their focus shifted to an inevitable geopolitical clash of two civilizations, namely Russia and the West. They were less interested in any other civilizations, and if they sometimes mentioned them in passing, In order to reveal deep roots of the confrontation, they followed Alexander Dugin and depicted two civilizations in question as Hyperborea and Atlantis, which was mostly characteristic for a politicized pseudoscientific literature or science fiction. For example, the leader of the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, Gennady Zyuganov, turned to the Eurasian idea already in 1992, being influenced by Dugin. Ever since, a class struggle was replaced in his mind by geopolitics, and an image of the bourgeois West was forced out by an image of the maritime civilization. He argued that to resist it, one had to reestablish the Eurasian power represented by the Great Russia. Certain bureaucrats and political activists loved this idea, as they felt nostalgia for the USSR. Indeed, many ethnic Russian adherents of the civilization idea identify the territory of the former USSR or the Russian Empire with a single Eurasian civilization. Finally, the fourth group consisted of the Russian Orthodox radicals, which combined certain priests together with lay people, political activists, journalists, and writers. They based themselves on the Russian Orthodox eschatology and worried about coming the end of time and the Antichrist arrival. In this respect, Russia was depicted as Katechon or restrainer, whose mission was to rescue the world from Antichrist, as though he was already arrived to the West. That is why the West backslides and was being rapidly disintegrated. To put it other way, Russia is identified with a civilization of good and the West with one of evil. Now let's turn to a few cases. For example, an economist, Oleg Platonov, viewed history as a clash of two civilizations, the Russian Orthodox one and the Judeo-Masonic, which manifested a 2,000-year conflict between Christianity and the Judeo-Talmudic ideology. He presented Russia as the key Christian country, where the Russian people temporarily diverged from the faith, and the tragedy of the 20th century were a result. This view made up a core of all his conspiracy theories, which identified the Jews with the devil's children and accused them of the secret plots in order to murder the Christian monarchs. In addition, Platonov argued that the Pope was a staunch Jewish ally in his struggle against the Christian Rus. It is in this way that Pope proved to be an enemy of the true Christianity and served Antichrist. An economist, Valentin Kasatonov, the professor of the prestigious Moscow State Institute of the International Relations, also focused on only two civilizations. Initially, he imagined them as a money civilization and a Christian civilization, where the former, being filled with the Jewish spirit, was continuously corrupting and conquering the latter. He was obsessed with the Jewish factor and argued that the Jews, inspired by the international Zionism, wanted to establish their world dominance rather than to have economic benefits only. Later on, he renamed these two civilizations as one of Avil and another one of Cain. In his view, the Cain's descendants distorted the original teaching through an introduction of Talmud and Kabbalah and pushed the world to the end of time, that is, to apocalypse. He argued that Holy Rus belonged to the Avil civilization and protested against its integration into the Cain civilization. Since recently, the General Leonid Ivashov combined geopolitical and eschatological paradigms, While presenting himself as the main authority in geopolitics, he failed to add any new ideas to the discourse of the clash of civilizations. However, his narrative made clear what was carefully hidden or skipped by the other authors. Firstly, despite he filled the world with a number of various civilizations, he focused on a struggle between a maritime or Anglo-Saxon civilization and terrestrial or Russian one. He claimed that the former viewed Russia only as an object of prey. Secondly, this is not just a clash of civilization, but a predestination for their eternal struggle. Thirdly, he explained that the Western society, precisely its elite part, being controlled by the Jewish financial capital, destroyed all the principles at which the humanity has been built up and leads the world to its death. In his other talk, he made it clear that the United States were ruled by the Jewish capital of the Hasidic type. Thus, in his view, the West is ruled by the Jews. Finally, he presented Russia as the Katechon. To put it other way, he easily shifted from geopolitics to religion dogmatic lexicon, which is based on quite different ideas of the end of time and an arrival of Antichrist. Indeed, it is already for 30 years that following Metropolitan Ioan, the Russian Orthodox radicals used to depict the world history as the struggle between two civilizations, a good one, Russian Orthodox, and a civilization of evil, Judeo-Masonic. The former acts on behalf of Jewish Christ and the latter on behalf of Antichrist. In fact, this narrative restores the Nazi messianic myth, where good was represented by the German spiritual civilization and evil was identified with the spiritless, plutocratic Western civilization, which was a substitution of the world Jewish plot. It was no accident that Ivashov prefaced his coverage of the West with a motto from the New Testament, which told of the Antichrist. Indeed, according to Russian Orthodox radicals, the devil's forces, by which the Jews are meant, have already occupied almost an entire world, and only Russia is doing all the best to rescue it. However, evidently Russia also did not avoid this threat. Ivashov argued that at the time of the Civil War, the leaders of the White Movement defended Russia from Judaism and Zionism, and he depicted Bolsheviks as the Bolshevik Zionists. This is what is meant by aforementioned eternal struggle between good and evil, Jesus Christ and Satan, which would be waged till the second coming. Thus, the contemporary Russian Orthodox radicals share an archaic medieval eschatological myth which made the Jews as Satan's army. It is this very myth which is referred to by Ivashov's geopolitical narrative on a struggle between two civilizations. Now, a secular version of this narrative was developed by Maxim Kalashnikov, who depicted an opposition of the two worlds, the American one based on the Jewish Talmudic spirit and the Aryo-Slavic one with its Byzantine Orthodox roots represented by the Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians. To put it other way, there was a struggle between two civilizations, Yankee Zionist and Imperial Aryo-Slavic. While making an emphasis on the Russian Orthodoxy, Kalashnikov pointed out his respect to the pre-Christian pagan faith and claimed that one should forbid foreign religions created by other people to enter the state, as though the Russian Orthodoxy was not such a foreign religion initially. He explained that people and states were based on religion, yet he didn't restrict himself with religion alone. He depicted the imperial warriors as not only strong and courageous, but also being of white race and with white hair. Later on, he viewed the West and the USA as some anti-humanity that could be resisted only by Russia. One of his later books had a subtitle, Russia is at the point of death, Apocalypse Nowadays. To put it other way, he depicted a battle between Antichrist and the Katechon. To be precise, he revised his former views later on and presented the Russian nomenclature as the main enemy. However, coming back to eschatological view of history, he declared that the gigantic historical cycle was over and apocalyptic scenario was very close. He recalled the Soviet victory over the Nazi Germany and lamented on the disintegration of the Soviet Union. Thus, he claimed, there was no moral restrainer, and that is why an arrival of fascism is inevitable. Okay, a civilizational discourse is evidently an elite one. It is a response to globalization, which scares national elites in the modernized states, and they do all the best to secure a political sovereignty, which means their privileges. Although they claim that there is already some civilization identity, there are even books on that. This is very far from the truth. According to opinion polls, the civilizational discourse is less popular among the general public. And despite all the efforts of the authorities, it looks very marginal in the textbooks. Whereas a civilization discourse inspired minorities in the 1990s, later on it was appropriated by the state and all other views were marginalized. For President Putin, this discourse means a struggle for a sphere of influence, which covers at least the former Soviet territory and aims at regaining imperial control, but his ambitions go much further. However, all his efforts to build up some Eurasian Union brought up very poor results, as well as his attempts to construct some United States. And the Russian Orthodox Church wants to secure a canonical territory which goes far beyond the state borders and encompasses the Russian Orthodox people abroad. They are considered to be united by some spirituality rather than any national territory, laws, and institutions. However, this is also a very fragile construction, as it was demonstrated by the church split in the Ukraine. Okay, so much for that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now you can ask the questions. Possibly I will ask the first question.
Can I?
Oh, okay. Okay.
Thank you. My questions is to Professor Shnirelman. And the first question is, you spoke about the conviction of the certain part, maybe the religions part of Eurasian part of Russian society, that the world is ruled by Jewish capital. Does it mean that there is an anti-Semitism in modern Russia? As I know, it's not as strong as, for example, at the beginning of the 20th century. And on the high level, it's not true. And the second question, maybe it's off topic. How do you feel about the actually ultimatum put forward by the Russian foreign ministry to NATO and the Western states, where it's required not to deploy weapons or military bases on the territory of all post-Soviet states? Does it mean that the Russian leadership views the post-Soviet space as its territory? And you'd mentioned about it. Thank you.
Well, you are certainly up to the point when you mentioned that the level of anti-Semitism in Russia is pretty low now. Well, that's what is proven by all the opinion polls during last years. That's for sure. But you know, what I discuss here is an elite discourse, and we have this elite discourse, and it seems, you know, superficially it seems pretty marginal, but I'm studying this discourse for at least 20 years. And I see that these books are published, and they are published and republished. And despite there are laws against national hatred and against racial hatred in Russia, all these authors, and there are many of them, they are not taken to the court. They are not tried. Only Oleg Platonov had problems during the last several years, but he was the only one. The others are still publishing, you know, all these crazy ideas, and from time to time, it is what I studied, and I published something about all these trends. From time to time, we have sudden growth of anti-Semitism, dealing with some particular cases. For example, as it was in 2017, dealing with the anniversary of the October Revolution. There was a discourse, you know, about Bolshevism, about Jews, and all this stuff. Then next year, 2018, when there was an anniversary of murder of the Tsar's family, there was also a discourse with the references to Jewish plot, to you know, this crazy idea that the Jews wanted to destroy the Katechem, and the Tsar, within this discourse, Tsar was interpreted as a Katechem, that is a restrainer. And from time to time, there are some, you know, some talks of some well-known journalists or even deputies of the Russian parliaments. It's well known, but immediately there are scandals, and these people complain, and you know, that's what I mean, that anti-Semitism is still there. Although it's probably for some people it seems that it's somewhere under the carpet. And well, the last point dealing with this particular case is that now under pandemic, there is also a growth of anti-Semitism, because there are a lot of talks about conspiracy, about Rothschild, about Soros, about Jewish financial support for vaccination, but vaccination is just, you know, to infuse, you know, the chips within the skin, you know, and
conspirology theories, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. It's world over. Okay. I guess I gave an answer to your inquiry, right? What concerns the second one, you know, I frankly, I don't want to get deeper into this particular case because it's well known and there are a lot of discussions, a lot of experts, you know, discuss this Russian manifest. But this is just a projection of this view of confrontation of two civilizations, what I mentioned. And somewhere between the line, there is, you know, this view of the Katechan, which is not mentioned by President Putin, for example. But I get that he is well aware of this concept because, you know, he has his dacha near Valam monastery, and from time to time he goes there. He is discussing all these matters with monarchs there in the Valam monastery. And these people, they're, you know, they're well aware of the concept of the end of time, of Antichrist, you know, all these ideas. So, well, that's it.
Okay, just a short question and please short answer. You mentioned the eschatological tendencies in Russian church, in Russia in general, and you talked about special historical missions as Russia see it in its policy. Can you say something? Do you think there are some parallel phenomenon in European Union, in Europe? I think it links to what Professor Trigana taught. Or do you think that it has no ground, such tendencies in Europe?
Very short answer.
Yeah.
Have no idea. I'm not an expert in European stuff.
Okay.
I can't say anything, you know, about Europe.
Okay, we will think about it.
Probably Professor Trigano will say something.
Yes.
I think that it's clear that the European Union renounced to mention in his constitutional text the Judeo-Christian values of civilization. Jacques Chirac, who was the president of France, opposed to this idea. And it's to be, I think, to be politically correct with the immigrants. And I think it opens the way to a profound crisis. This is a sort of empire which does not recognize its foundations, the values upon which it was founded. So the European people do not know where they stand, where they are going to. And there is a profound problem of identity, collective identity of this ensemble. You know, the phenomenon of Central Europe states who do not agree with Western Europe states. There is an inside concurrency between them. And it's interesting to see that the Central Europe, the Visegrad group, as it is named, are more defending the European values, and especially, I think, the religious one, They are friends of Israel also. There was a politic of Netanyahu, which tried to find a support among them against the spirit of Western Europe. And in Western Europe, as I tried to explain, there is a profound crisis of the national identities of Europe, because there is no, Europe didn't carry a positive message, only a constitutional, juridical message, but not a positive message. And it's the open door from developing nationalist tendencies against Europe. And in France, it's exactly the situation today before the next presidential elections, that is the debate, the public debate is turning around of preservation of French identity against politically correctness, which is in fact the dominant sound of the media, of politicians and so on. And there is a divorce between the mass and the leadership.
Thank you very much.